The theft of Ukrainian children is a topic that unfortunately goes heavily underreported. That is why today I am honored that I get to sit down and speak with Danica Stanciu, an American volunteer who spent a large amount of her time volunteering with the organization Save Ukraine. Mykola Kuliba's organization that is dedicated to rescuing some of the most vulnerable in Ukrainian society, whether that is from potential frontline zones or getting children back from Russia. Thank you very much for sitting down and chatting with me today.
You're welcome.
Would you mind telling everyone who you are and what you do?
My name is Danica Stanciu. Always the hardest part of explaining who I am, my name. I right now am employed at AFGHAN. However, I have come to Ukraine. This is now my third trip in a year with various volunteer efforts, most notably Save Ukraine.
And what was your connection into Ukraine? How did you first feel like you wanted to come to this country and help and aid and volunteer?
The story actually starts 30 years ago. So my name is Danica, which is Croatian. I grew up in Michigan, but my father's family is from Croatia. And I was in high school during the war in Bosnia and Croatia and felt for the first time it was an awakening of what did it mean to be Croatian, and started a lifelong journey that included a lovely but utterly useless bachelor's degree in Russian East European Studies. I did not study Russian. I actually took the East Central European variant and eventually met a man from Romania with whom I have two wonderful children. But through both study and experience came to appreciate, one, the horrors of war, as well as Russian aggression and Russian colonialism. And so the first day of the full-scale invasion, I knew I had to come. I just didn't know how.
And so you were looking for different ways, different avenues that you could come and do anything you could on there.
I did. So I have, as I mentioned, two children. And at the time, my oldest was just about to graduate from high school. My youngest only had a year after that. So I knew that from a timing perspective, I probably couldn't go in 2022. But what I did do is go to Romania. I've spent 20 years going back and forth in Romania. I speak Romanian. My in-laws didn't speak any English. And I thought, maybe I can go to Romania and try this on. So my then employer, Politico, was very gracious, and I took a month. I went to Cluj, Romania, where a number, actually a few thousand Ukrainian refugees had settled. And just by way of context, about a million Ukrainian refugees entered Romania in the early days after the war. I don't know how many remain, but I think there were still many thousands when I was there in 2022. Through a friend, I found an organization called Dobra Hata, Good House, that served as a community center for displaced Ukrainians. By nature, were mostly women and children. And I spent a month there, assisting in the food pantry and teaching English to teenagers. And when I say teaching English, it was really English conversation. Come practice your English. And I would arrange for little field trips. Let's go to the Botanic Garden. Let's go have pizza. And through that experience, I knew that, one, it was something that I could do, that I wanted to do, and knew I had to find a way to Ukraine.
What can you tell me a little bit about that time with them, seeing how they were reacting, having come to a new country, having left? Did anyone talk to you about how they were feeling or their experiences?
And they sure did. With the children, who were mostly teenagers, I actually tried not to ask too much except, how are you today? However, I spent quite a bit of time with the women who ran the food pantry. And through them and through seeing many of the customers, if you will, of the pantry, I heard stories. Stories of husbands and loved ones left behind. Stories of women who were struggling to suddenly raise their children alone in a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, as welcoming as it was. I heard stories and saw people checking their phones incessantly for updates about what was happening in their hometowns, what was happening to their loved ones. And I will say I also just felt the anxiety, the anguish, the pain of simply being with many of these Ukrainians who were suffering so much. It wasn't until I experienced that, just sitting with it, that I came to understand the enormity of it.
You had a lot of educational background into Russian aggression, into their colonialism, their efforts. I remember my first time sitting back and seeing the direct firsthand aftermath of this. Do you think that that feeling is something you can only get when you see it firsthand? That it's hard to kind of to explain to somebody else?
100%. My mother-in-law, rest in peace, my mother-in-law would explain to me she was born in 42, and some of her earliest childhood memories are when the Russians occupied her village in Romania. And they shot anyone who was associated with the previous regime as potentially fascist. Maybe they were, but the method was to leave the body in the middle of the street, and if the family came to get the body, they would shoot everyone else. She said that only happened once or twice before the bodies were left there, when the villagers understood what would happen. And I don't think I anticipated the news of Bucha and Irpin and everything that's come afterwards, but until you see it and experience it, it's another thing. Prior to that, it was a story, a terrible story, and now it's become a reality. And not my lived experience, but certainly being here, it's very real.
It imparts on you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think that people do enough for people in the West or in the US to try to convey this?
You know, I think it is really hard to convey. I have so many friends and family who ask me what it's like. I should explain that I've never been to the front line, and most of my time has been here in Kyiv, although I have traveled a little bit. And when I explain to them how beautiful Kyiv is, how wonderful the food, the coffee is. I swear I can get better coffee here than I can in Washington, D.C.
100%.
No
yes.
offense to my favorite cafes in D.C., but the quality of living in many ways here is, I think, incomprehensible to people to understand, and yet it's a city at war. And at any time, an air raid siren can and does go off. A missile could hit you. The realities of being in a modern European city at war, though not under constant artillery fire, as so many cities are in Ukraine, is, I think, really hard for people to understand. And candidly, I had no idea until I came myself. And that's why I appreciate the opportunity to explain to others and appreciate the work that you're doing to help people understand that this is not so far away from our lives.
It's easy to push it away and say it is so far away. Or for even malicious actors to say, oh, someone's out enjoying coffee, enjoying a beer, they're having a good time.
This can't be war,
It
or
can't
this
be
can't
war.
be, like they're saying.
And I think people also forget sometimes how large Ukraine is. It's, width-wise even larger than Texas.
I mean, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I will admit to, I can't speak to anyone else, though I've gotten a number of friends who've said, yep, that's right. When you think of war, I think so many Americans instantly play images in their mind from Afghanistan, from Iraq, when I was growing up, and certainly think of war only on the front lines and destroyed buildings. And so it's a very nuanced thing to explain how war manifests in a city that's not on the front line, but still under attack.
Yes, I'd very much agree. After that little while in Romania that you had taken, it sounds like you were galvanized to step up and to do more. Can you explain to me a little bit about that process for you?
Yes, that's right. I think galvanized is exactly the right word. I just felt like I just knew I had to come, and after trying it on, I was sure. It was not something that I took lightly. As a mom, as a daughter, I knew I needed to be very careful and considerate around what I was doing. At the same time, I knew I had to come. It was almost a compulsion. An opportunity presented itself. So my youngest graduated from high school, and after almost a decade at Politico, it was simply time for me to find something new. And so I decided to take what I call a service sabbatical, or a professional gap year, and that I had saved and planned and prepared to come to Ukraine and help in whatever way possible. And the single best piece of advice I got was from Nate Mook, former CEO of World Central Kitchen, who now serves as special advisor to the Howard Buffett Foundation that's doing incredible work here in Ukraine. But Nate said to me over coffee in Washington, D.C., just show up. He said, there aren't a ton of foreign volunteers. You show up, you'll find it, you'll find something, and I'll introduce you to folks. And that's kind of what I did.
A lot of it is just showing up and having those first steps in the door and people seeing you as wanting to help, wanting to do something. And
that's exactly right. I had planned to take, so I left my job. My daughter graduated in June of 2023, and I had planned to spend up to the rest of the year in Ukraine. But I decided to do that sort of in two pieces. The first piece was to spend a couple of months traveling and visiting friends, many of whom I had met in Romania, who had returned to Ukraine. Due to the strain on their marriages and their families, the strain on their jobs. Many of them had returned. And so I was going to travel and visit them. I was going to sort of speed date volunteer. So try a bunch of different volunteering opportunities till I found a fit, and network as much as I could. And maybe I should say I networked first to find the volunteering opportunities. And at first when I got here, I felt a little bit guilty about the traveling. I traveled all over the country to visit friends in the north and in the east, in Dnipro, which was as close to the front line as I got, in the center of the country and in the west. And I realized later how important that was to my friends, that they had the opportunity to show me how beautiful their country was. And it was not just what you saw in the newspapers of destroyed buildings, of missile attacks, that it's truly a gorgeous place with a deep and complex history, with great food, great hospitality. And so once I relaxed into that, I really enjoyed visiting my friends. And I did that almost every weekend. And during the week, I volunteered. And I volunteered at any place that I could and networked. And that's how I found Save Ukraine. Nate introduced me to Mykola Kuleba. Mykola is a former a member of the Zelensky administration and the prior administration, the Poroshenko administration, which is very unusual. Zelensky kind of cleaned house. That was part of his campaign promise. But he held over a couple of folks, and Mykola was one of them. Mykola was the Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights and has a long history of advocating for children and advocating for social reform vis-a-vis child welfare. He started an NGO called Save Ukraine 10 years ago, so at the start of the first invasion, primarily focused on evacuating the most vulnerable, children and families, from the front lines, as well as the disabled. But he is best known for rescuing and returning children who've been kidnapped by Russia back to Ukraine. And so I had heard of Mykola, candidly was a little intimidated to reach out to him. I thought, why would he speak to me? He's, as you probably know, a personality here in Ukraine. He's well known. He's on the TV. He's both here and in the United States. And but I said, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. And something about the mission, as well as the man, it was just the right combination. And I knew I had found my thing, if you will, here in Ukraine.
And you ended up staying with them for quite a while.
I did. So after almost 2 months in Ukraine, June, July, the first part of August, I went back to the United States. My daughter was going to the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was a freshman, and so it felt important for me to bring her and get her settled. My son is a sophomore, now rising junior at Northwestern. And so I wanted to bring my kids to college. And I think psychologically, it was easier for me to take my time in Ukraine in chunks. I was open to the possibility that it wasn't going to work out, that maybe I didn't find that thing, but at least I knew I tried. But I did find that thing. Yes, I showed up. But I found that thing, and that thing actually found me in America. So Mykola called me and said, I'm coming to Washington. Would you help? And I said, I'd be delighted. And through my time at Politico, I had a number of contacts on the Hill. And so we visited a few congressional offices, both the Senate and the House, across parties, to talk about the issue of child abduction, which is something that became, I think, both sides recognize this as an atrocity, as a war crime, and in fact, the House has labeled it genocide. So I joined Mykola for a week in Washington, and I was kind of like his Sherpa. I would pick him up at his hotel, we'd go do visits, both with privately and publicly, if you will, advocating with potential donors, and I, if you will, followed him back to Ukraine in October, and spent October, November, and December with the Save Ukraine team, doing a number of things.
There's a lot that I want to ask you about Save Ukraine and a lot of the different efforts that have seen through and that have happened there. How much do you know or could speak on everything from 2014 to the full-scale invasion?
Less on 2014, although I can speak about it, for example, on the lens of child abduction, actually began then. As the Russians occupied Donbass, through the Soviet legacy of institutionalizing children, there were a lot of children in institutions. Some of them were true orphans, some of them de facto orphans. The state encouraging parents who suffer from addiction, who suffer from, candidly, poverty, to turn their children over to the state. And one of the things that Mykola, during his time in office, advocated for was small group homes, foster families, and moving away from deinstitutionalization. Ukraine is still in the process of that. So when the Russians invaded, Many children were still in institutions, and those children were placed under Russian control. Some transferred back to Russia. Many of the young men and some young women put into military schools. And we now have a growing body of evidence that Ukrainian children have been used candidly as cannon fodder in a war against their own country. And that really began in 2014. That I can speak to. I'm less nuanced on so many of the other issues beginning in 2014.
I think it's important to lay out, though, that this isn't a new development.
Thing. No.
The Russians have done this for quite a while to take these children, like you said, kind of bring them into their system and train them up to then be used on a full-scale war against their home country.
And we really know that there's a legacy of this that goes back 100 years. The Soviets, and indeed primarily the Russians, transferred peoples from across the empire to weaken nationalism, to repopulate areas like the east of Ukraine with ethnic Russians. We know that there is a long, long history of this, but it really began the transfer, the illegal transfer of children from their homes and their home country by Russia began in 2014.
And against Ukraine, it's been especially bad. And
that's right.
We can see how it affects even different facets of life. I remember I believe you had brought up something about working with Save Ukraine on an educational front as well with some of these children.
That's right. So primarily what I did, and it was not what I thought I was going to do, but it's where I think my skills best lend themselves to support their work, was actually working in their development office, fundraising. And I also assisted with speech writing. So Mykola makes statements all of the time to different parliaments. He's made statements in front of the Helsinki Commission, and being a native speaker of English, and it was the first time that my degree in Russian East European Studies became useful, that I assisted with speech writing, particularly on the issue of abduction. So educating legislators about this issue and some of the broader public. And I also spent time with the kids themselves. So anyone who wanted to practice English, but I was very careful not to ask about their experiences so as not to re-traumatize. And if they wanted to talk about it, great. Otherwise, it was, how are you today? What do you want to do? What do you want to talk about? What do you enjoy doing in your free time? That kind of thing.
As I've had the opportunity to speak with a couple younger people and their younger teenagers who have grown up in even occupied areas, I've seen that there's sometimes a change that comes through or a different development that happens with them. Was this something you've noticed as well, having worked with the kids, even if it wasn't vocalized to you?
So I should, if you don't mind, I'm going to share some numbers because I think it's shocking and illuminating. So the Russians themselves, Putin and specifically his deputy, Maria Lvova-Belova, has bragged to taking up to 744,000 Ukrainian children. Bragged about it. Most experts agree that at least 200,000 children have been transferred. And the Ukrainian government has identified about 20,000. So these are names, locations, have 20,000 in a database. Altogether, 500 have been returned, just over 500. And Save Ukraine to date has returned just over 300. So we're talking about the tip of the spear. And many of the returned children are teenagers. Save Ukraine runs a hotline, a 0800 number that you can call and say, I need evacuation, I've got a child with cerebral palsy or limited mobility, and we need assistance getting out. I have an elderly person that I'm caretaking for, we need special assistance, or simply we want to get out. So many of the children have called the hotline They have cell phones, and they've said, get me the out of here. And so the children that are doing that, and really many of them are young adults, are extraordinarily strong and have resisted brainwashing efforts. And I heard someone say this, and I thought about it, and this is true of me too. I'm a people pleaser. If I was in a Russian camp being told to sing the Russian anthem, I'm pretty sure that within a week, I'd be singing the anthem. And especially when you're so vulnerable. So the children that have called and said, I want out, are amongst the very strongest, those that have resisted. However, we should not underestimate Russian brainwashing. And many of these children have been under that influence for almost a decade. And so I have heard a young man tell his story who was kidnapped by the Russians, transferred from camp to camp to camp, brought back by his sister, who said, I'm going to go back when I turn 18. My best friend is there. They told me I'll get an apartment. Yeah, and it's not so bad. And I don't think, I certainly don't have any answers on how you undo a decade of incessant propaganda. I also wonder about the children now who are in the occupied territories in Crimea. Yes. How affected they are by the nonstop propaganda and lies that we know they've been told. So I don't know how anyone emerges from that situation not marked.
And that's sometimes a very deep mark, especially with children.
A very deep mark.
Being, your most influential years, as a lot of people will say.
That's right.
Growing up with this.
That's right. That's right. And that's why I think I was so drawn to Save Ukraine, which is they don't just bring the children back. Children, families are given months of therapy, months of support, particularly the children who were rescued and returned. And they are kept with each other because of their shared experience, their shared understanding, although every experience is different. But they are not left alone. They are given lots and lots of support to help make that turn and reassimilate to Ukrainian society.
You had mentioned that obviously, of course, you didn't want to ask them about their time in captivity to re-traumatize them, that maybe some have shared a story or two with you. Would you feel comfortable in, obviously not naming it, of course, but sharing some things you might have heard?
Yes. And I actually would encourage anyone who's listening. There are a couple of stories where the children have told the stories themselves. I think that is the most powerful. There is one young woman, her name is Ksenia Kolden, and I will share with you her name because she is, one, not a minor any longer, and two, she is a spokesperson on behalf of abducted children. She recently published an op-ed that you can find on Fox News and a number of different places. Ksenia Kolden with a K, both first and last name. She was true orphan. Her brother and her were living with a foster family in Kharkiv Oblast, so just outside of Kharkiv, and their village was one of the first to be occupied during the first days of the full-scale invasion. The Russians pressured her Ukrainian foster family to give them up, and both children were transferred across the Ukrainian border to Russia. She was put into a technical college, and her brother was put together with a Russian foster family 900 kilometers away. They were told it was only going to be 3 weeks, temporary, to move them away from fighting. It turned out to be, I think, around 7 months. And when Ksenia turned 18, which she did in captivity, if you will, she was pressured to get a Russian passport. And this is a very, very common theme from many of the older children who turn of age to get a Russian passport. There's pressure to Russify their names so they sound less Ukrainian. We know that children have been issued new birth certificates. And Ksenia is one of the few who said, no, thank you. I'm Ukrainian. I do not want a Russian passport. They kicked her out of school. Here's an orphan, totally vulnerable. They kicked her out of school, and she had a Russian friend with whom she stayed. And after asking, you know, like, I got to get out of here, one of her friends said, call this number, and it was Save Ukraine. So she called Save Ukraine, and she said, get me out of here, and I'm not leaving without my brother. So she goes with volunteers who are risking their lives, to her brother, who had succumbed to Russian propaganda. And he said, there are Nazis in Ukraine. There's war in Ukraine. They don't want us there. And she, and this is a quote that I think is so extraordinary, I gathered my will into a fist. I gathered my will into a fist, and she said, I am not leaving here without my brother. 4 hours later, she convinced him to go with her. And it was her telling him, if you don't come with me, we will never be able to see each other again. And that got him over the line. He agreed to go with her, and they made their way out. They had to not share that they were going back to Ukraine every step of the way while they were in Russia. And they eventually made it back. I am pleased to say Ksenia is a university student. She's studying journalism. She is telling her story on behalf of other abducted children. Her brother is with a Ukrainian foster family, and by all accounts, very happy. He's got his own room, which he loves. And but they are an exceptional story. She is an exceptional young woman, and I'm delighted to share her story with you, and I hope that you hear it from her herself.
While this may not be a typical story you see reported in this conflict, unfortunately it is not a rare one. And if you do appreciate this reporting, please consider subscribing. This goes a long way in helping me be able to bring these stories to light. With Save Ukraine, obviously your time there had come to an end at the end of last year. Do you miss it?
Oh, so much. I will say my time came to an end because it was the Christmas holiday. I needed to go home to my family, but I can't say I was done yet, but I needed to go home and go back for my family. I also had to face the reality that I couldn't be on my professional gap year forever, and that eventually I'd need to find employment, particularly because we don't have national health care in the United States, and there were other realities that I, just simply needed to take care of. But I can't say I was done. I am very grateful, however, that I have the opportunity to see Save Ukraine quite frequently in Washington, D.C., where I live. Since I left in December, I have hosted 5 returned children at my home on Capitol Hill when they came to testify before the Helsinki Commission and do a media tour. And the Save Ukraine team comes quite frequently to the United States for advocacy, for fundraising, and so I have the opportunity to see and support them in the ways that I can now. And then, I found my way back to Ukraine, even if briefly.
There's a magnetic pull that keeps bringing you back.
100%. 100%.
With Save Ukraine's work in Capitol Hill, could you speak on a little bit of what that was like with your time to help and to go there and talk with the legislators?
Absolutely, and I'd love to share a story. And I think it speaks to the power of this issue of child abduction. I also would like to remind my fellow Americans, and this was a good reminder to me, as we've become more and more embittered and more partisan, that people are still people. So one of the visits that I set up for Mykola and myself back in September was with Senator Roger Wicker. I believe he's the senior Republican from Mississippi. And we did not have an audience one-on-one with him, but instead his staff said, well, the senator does Mississippi Morning. Many senators and people in the House invite their constituents and others to, weekly or bi-weekly, they don't happen every week, gatherings. And so Mykola and I went, and so we were in a group of people, certainly not constituents, and the senator met with us. We spoke with him very briefly, but the senator's wife was there, Gail Wicker. And she was moved to tears hearing about Save Ukraine's work, hearing about abducted children. And she said, wait right here. We didn't think anything of it. We started speaking to some of the other guests of the morning. And she came back with Senator Joni Ernst. She literally went down the hallway and grabbed someone and said, you've got to hear this. Mykola kind of whispers to me under his breath, who is this? And I'm like, shut up, you just want to talk to her. And so we spoke a little bit with her. Now fast forward, 4 or 5 months, where Mykola's back in Washington, this time with 5 returned children, 3 of whom were testifying to the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I'm in the audience, and I see Gail Wicker come in. So I stand up and I said, Gail, I'm sure you don't remember me, but I had the pleasure of meeting you back in September. So delighted to see you here. She said, I do. She said, I wanted to offer my support. I heard the children were here today. Would you introduce me to one? I said, sure. So she walked up and I introduced her to a young man. She was visibly moved to tears, and she wanted to tell him she knew about his plight. She supported him, and she kept him in her prayers. And she asked if she could hug him. And I happened to be a member of the other party, and it was an excellent reminder for me of the humanity in our fellow people that I think we often lose sight of. I have lost sight of myself, I'll be the first to admit, and I was so moved and so touched. And I just want to share that story with you. So that's some of the things that we've done on the Hill across both parties. Now, I will say that, as I said, both parties seem to understand and support the heinous crime that is child abduction. Now, the politics around broader aid for Ukraine are another story.
It gets a little bit more murky.
That's right.
In there, but
that's right.
I think that's very true. That especially in the U.S. and majority of people watching will probably be from the U.S. that we get very interlocking in our focus on internal politics, on which side is which, lines are drawn, but to come out and to see other parts of the world and to experience a human-to-human moment, I think that can really unlock something that we forget a lot of the time. And I think that's very important to look at and to highlight here. Obviously, with your background from Politico, living in D.C., having worked with people on the Hill, knowing these people probably for a very long time, and on those same lines, where do you think U.S. politics around Ukraine stands?
Well, as you know, the supplemental recently passed, yes. Of which I was incredibly relieved that it had. I am reading just like you, so I should also be clear, I am not a journalist. I work on the business side. I'm reading just like you are, that Biden is actually deprioritizing Ukraine because it has become a political issue, I think fed by so much misinformation. I don't know how we've lost the narrative about foreign aid, and that many even many well-educated people don't understand that 90% of foreign aid actually stays right in America, does not go to the pockets of anyone here in Ukraine, but actually supports Americans and American jobs. And somehow we've lost that narrative. And Ukraine has become a political issue. And because of that, Biden is deprioritizing it for the presidential campaign in advance of the election, and instead prioritizing the economy. I think both are very important. And what I wish many Americans understood is that it's not an either or, it's a yes and. We can support Ukraine and support our economy. Supporting Ukraine does not mean we can't support other initiatives, very important domestic initiatives in the United States. We are a country that can do both of these things, yet all too often it is presented as an either or, and that is also a reality. And so I'm quite concerned about how Ukraine is perceived now in the United States and will be moving forward. I am also I also find myself wanting when I look in major media outlets for news and stories about what's happening in Ukraine today.
And it almost like you were talking about with Biden deprioritizing it, a lot of news places have also deprioritized it, even though it is the largest war in Europe since World War II, the largest mass grave since the Yugoslav genocide, a linchpin in history.
The missing children, the largest missing persons case since World War II. And I can't believe that really any American wants Putin to win here. Yeah. But I can't believe that. I choose, not to believe that. But that is a very real possibility if we don't continue to focus on Ukraine.
Do you think we in the U.S. now, more than ever, have a Russian propaganda problem?
Oh, 100%. We've had Russian interference in our election, certainly in 2016, possibly before that. I would be very curious to know what percentage, how much money Russia spends on its propaganda machine. And I believe that we need to fight misinformation with information. And the Russians are so sophisticated and nuanced. And I hear Russian tropes all of the time from very well-educated, very well-informed people in the United States. But it is seeped into our media, our culture, in ways that I now see that I don't think I was sensitive to prior to this experience.
It is eye-opening in a way to come out to see different things. You go, oh, this is where this came from. This is where this narrative. This is where this person who you might have even thought or learned of as Russian was actually is Ukrainian, or is the person from another country within the Soviet Union, that they've taken them and repurposed them for their uses. So,
That's right. That's right.
What do you feel is a responsibility for somebody who comes to Ukraine, who knows what we do, who've talked with people as we have to do once we're back in the U.S.?
So certainly share. It's one reason why I'm sitting down with you, to talk about what's happening here, the reality of the situation. It is very clear to me from being here, from meeting the people that I have, from working with the children that I have, that Russia has one intention, and that is to destroy Ukraine. Destroy its people, destroy its culture, its language. That is very clear to me. And I think the Ukrainians are very clear on that as well. So I feel obligated to share what's happening. I feel obligated to inform people. If I had $1, Devin, for every person that said, I had no idea Russia was kidnapping Ukrainian children, or why would they do that? And trying to find a crisp, succinct way to share that, I'm absolutely obligated by what I've seen and experienced to do so.
I feel that any stories that I am told that that I can share that bring to people? You know, once you get back to the U.S. and tell them where you've been, it's always the first question. You know, what's it like there? What's happening here? Are we really seeing what's going on? That tends to be a stronger narrative that I've heard.
It just feels so black and white to me. Yeah. And I have to believe that America and many people around the world value democracy, value rule of law, and you know, at the very least, should understand that about this fight and all of the atrocities that Russia is committing. I think it's something like 1 in every 7 Ukrainian school has been destroyed by Russia. So not only are they taking children, but they are removing the means of education and really methodically destroying Ukraine's future.
I think that we've talked about how the battle here, seems very black and white, and that everyone should be able to stand up for this democracy. I think other countries that are often, unfortunately, referred to as post-Soviet countries see this as well. I know, especially with everything going on in Georgia right now. One of the questions I get asked a lot when I'm back there is, do you think Putin or do you think Russia would stop at Ukraine?
We know he wouldn't. We know he wouldn't. Russia right now controls 20% of Georgia, and through this legislation, certainly have aims for much more. We are concerned about the Baltics, I'm sure, Poland. Why would he stop? I think Zelensky actually best said it when he was asked, well, you know, why don't you negotiate? Russia effectively had Crimea and Donbass before starting this war. Putin did not invade from the east, but from the north to take Kyiv. He's not going to stop. He had, if you will, huge swaths of Ukraine to begin with. He's not going to stop.
Yeah, it would seem unimaginable.
No, I think the data is very clear around this, and someone who says otherwise is willfully ignoring the facts.
Yes, I'd very much agree. Coming near the end, I wanted to ask a question earlier, but I think it's a little bit more poignant now. How has your time here changed you?
I think I'm just beginning to understand that. And I think it will take me a long, long time before I fully appreciate. I don't mean to sound cheesy, but my heart is so much bigger. I have so many more friends. I feel that I know something that I didn't know before, really know. And I am not a particularly religious person, but I went to Catholic school. And in Catholic school, there was a song that we often sang that was associated with St. Francis that said, "In giving you shall receive." And I did not appreciate how much I would receive from my attempts to give and from the giving that I've done here. And I don't know exactly how that's changed me, and I think it will take a long time to really appreciate it.
Very beautifully put. Last question I have for you. If there was something, like I've mentioned before, that it would probably be a lot of Americans listening to this.
I hope so.
I get a rare opportunity here to interview somebody who's also American, so I have questions about it. But what would you tell an American who's not in a position like us to have been here, to have come here? What piece of advice would you give them about Ukraine? What would you want them to know or look into?
That Ukraine is fighting for American ideals, for democracy, for rule of law. And I would ask them not to look away. I would ask them not to look away because we know Xi is not looking away, China's not looking away, North Korea certainly is not looking away, Iran is not looking away. and they're all cheering someone who is the opposite of the best of America. And as an American, I ask you not to look away. I tell you that this is in America's interests. Our world is safer and more secure because of Ukrainian resistance and resilience for a fraction of our defense budget. I wish that most Americans knew Ukraine has been able to hold off Russia for single digits of our defense budget. And they are not asking for American lives. They are just asking for our support, our munitions. They are giving their lives for the ideals that we hold dear. And I hope that that doesn't get lost over time. That is still true and more important than ever.
Danica, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you, Devin.